Good morning. I'm excited. I forgot to turn on my mic. As we always say, if you don't like organized religion, try us. We're not that organized. Well, mainly it's me. There's other people who are pretty organized, but not so much me. Hey, one of those big questions in life is who is Jesus? And different religions, different people kind of answer it different way. Some would say, he's just a prophet, and others would say he's some sort of manifestation of God. He was a holy man and a teacher. And actually, one of the ways you can tell whether because a lot of organizations, a lot of things call themselves Christian, but one of the main things that separates what we would consider Christian and non-Christian, because this is not the only church there is in town. There's some of you are like, what? There's a lot of other churches, and we're on the same team. We like to say we are Team Jesus. Yeah. I have friends that sometimes they're like, oh, you're our competition. And I'm like, you worship Satan? No, I meant and I'm like, then I won't let it go because I'm kind of a jerk like that. But anyway. There's certain things that we believe about who Jesus is, and that's what separates, Christian thought from other thought. We love other people, we just have a different view of Jesus that we think is pretty important. And it's been said that Jesus was either a lunatic, a liar, or Lord. And so today we're going to look at some of the things, one of the things that Jesus said about himself. And in the context, we've been in the book of Mark. I think this is week 40. Some of you are like, oh my gosh. Now, we took some breaks, where we did some other stuff, but I think unless, again, I may have skipped a number in there somewhere, because I do that. I had multiple weeks at I think 37. We were in week 37 for 3 weeks. That was a joke. Anyway, and so we've been looking, though, in the book of Mark, and we've been looking at different things, and we've hit this section now where this is like the last week of Jesus' life. And there's, been kind of questions, because Jesus comes in and he clears the temple. And so people are buying and selling in there where they shouldn't be. So Jesus is flipping the tables. And as we like to say, when people say act like Jesus, remind them that flipping tables and chasing people with whips is an option in there when you're acting like Jesus. And so he's doing this stuff. And so the religious authorities are coming to him and going, hey, by what authority are you doing this? And Jesus is like, okay, I'll tell you by what authority I do this. If you tell me that baptism from John, heaven or man? And they're like, well, we don't want to say from heaven because we really weren't all on board with John. We can't say from man because the people really liked him, so we'll say we don't know. And Jesus is like, okay, well, I'm not answering you either. And so taxes, they try to trap him. We were talking about this. A friend of mine who comes here, we were driving around for some reason. We got to talk about this because it's just such a fascinating passage when they come to Jesus and they're like, okay, do we have to pay the temple tax or not? Now, if he says, yes, you have to pay the temple tax, people are upset because they didn't like paying the taxes. Some of you don't like paying your taxes either. But especially if a government had come in, the Roman government took over, and so they're paying taxes to people who are oppressing them. Nobody wants to do that. So if he says that, he's not going to be popular. But if he says, oh, we don't have to pay taxes, the Romans are either going to imprison or kill him, right? They're going to take care of you. And so Jesus is like, hey, where's the coin for that? And they're like, oh, hold on, I got one. And he goes, oh, that's interesting. Whose image is on that? Caesar's. Well, give to Caesar what's Caesar's, give to God what's God's. And we're created in the image of God. There's all kinds of cool layers of stuff in there. There's been that. And then they try to trap him. Remember the Sadducees? Anybody remember how to remember what the Sadducees don't believe in? They're sad, you see, because they don't believe in the resurrection. That was a horrible joke that was told to me a long time ago. It was very punny. And I remember what the Sadducees believed because of that. And now you will too. You'll remember the horrible joke that Jeff told. And so, this woman, she gets married. Husband dies. And then in those days, it was the custom, the law prescribed, and the brother kind of takes over the job. And so 7 brothers, instead of 7 brides for 7 brothers, 1 bride for 7 brothers. They all die successfully, and at the resurrection, whose is she? And, I picture them kind of stumping the Pharisees on this all the time, and Jesus is like, hey, you don't even get it. Hey, that's not your mistake, because you don't know the scriptures, you don't know the power of God. When the dead rise, only marry or give in marriage, they respect they will be like the angels in heaven. And then last week we get to one of my favorite passages. They're like, hey, what's the most important law? Like if someone told you, as a believer and a follower of Jesus, what's the most important law? Because if you read the Bible, I know all of you do all the time, right? Some of you are laughing. That wasn't meant to be a joke. No, but if you've read the whole Bible, I remember I was preparing to go to seminary, and I was working in this warehouse for a pretty large company. I remember I was working with this guy, and I still remember him going, well, you haven't read the whole Bible, have you? And I'm like, yeah, I have. He said, what? I didn't think anyone actually read the whole thing. Well, I am about to go to school for it. I should, have read it. But then I got to seminary and found a lot of people who hadn't read it either. But that's a long story. But, it's like there's a lot of commands and things in there. What's the greatest one? Like, if you had to follow, just follow one, what would it be? And Jesus says, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with your mind, all your strength. The second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. And so we kind of love God, love people is what we talked about. So that's the setting for this next thing. And people have asked him questions. They've tried to stump him. They've asked him questions because he's like, well, he seems to be answering right. And now it's Jesus' turn to say something. And so it says, as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple, he asked, why do the teachers of the religious law claim that the Messiah is the son of David? For David himself, speaking under inspiration of the Holy Spirit, has said, the Lord said to my Lord, sit in the place of honor at my right hand until I humble your enemies beneath your feet. And since David himself called the Messiah my Lord, how can the Messiah be his son? And the large crowd listened to him with great delight. Now, this is sort of, this is Jesus' opportunity, and he gives them a riddle. Do you guys like riddles? No, okay, well then I'll just skip this section. No, I love riddles, and I remember one of the first ones I ever learned was, when is a door not a door?
When is a door?
And I didn't know the word ajar, so I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, when is a fish not a fish? When is a bird? It's like, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Now I know that the word ajar means something. I like kid ones. Our kids they were all ran to kids' church, I guess. Most of them. Why was 6 afraid of 7? You guys have terrible jokes. This is great. David's father has 3 sons. Snap, crackle, and David. Got you on one. Okay, the more you take, the more you leave behind. What am I? Firefly. There's a lot of stuff left behind a firefly.
Oh, yeah.
Which reminds me, we'll be, getting volunteers for that pretty soon because, your time flies away. Footsteps. Here's one for Lewis. It has many keys but can't open a single door. Piano. Because I said Lewis, you got it. But the riddle is... But a riddle is something that when you first hear it, you're kind of like puzzled. But then when you know the answer, it's sort of like, well, how did I not see that? That's pretty plain. Like a piano has keys, of course. And, David's father had 3 sons, Snap, Crackle, and we get led into thinking it's pop because that's what we want to say, because some of our joints sound like that when we try to do burpees. But, oh yeah, it's David, because David's, and so it's something that at the beginning doesn't look as obvious as after you kind of know the answer, it is. And so Jesus, where does he get this riddle? Now, this is out of Psalm 110, long understood to be a messianic promise. Now, what had happened was the Jewish people, there's a lot of history. The Old Testament's written over a long period of time. And so the Jewish people had these messianic hopes that someday the Messiah would come. And there were, the Psalms were, and I teach a course on the Psalms, which I enjoy. They're these songs, and there's different types of songs and everything. They're really cool, but some of them are messianic, meaning that they're pointing to this Messiah that is to come. And so, in fact, Psalm 110 is quoted a bunch in the New Testament, kind of explored a bit. And so, the essence of Jesus' question is, how is David's son also David's Lord? Because the Psalms, says, the Lord said to my Lord. And so, what's going on here? Now, David is this beloved king of Israel. If you haven't heard the story, he's the one with the slingshot and Goliath. I remember one time I went, in fact, Josh it was the same thing again, because they were like David and Goliath, because Josh was wrestling a very large individual in a tournament recently. And I remember I had to wrestle a very large person, and people were like, oh my gosh, and that happens when, believe it or not, I used to be a very light heavyweight. Why are you laughing? Yeah. Anyway, so David, he fights Goliath. That's the story maybe you've heard. And he becomes this beloved king of Israel. I picture, he was like the hero of Israel. I picture like kids for Halloween dressing up like David. Like I always dressed up like Superman. I always wanted to be Superman. Never happened. But, they don't really have Halloween. That was a joke. But no one seemed to get that one. So we'll keep moving. But he's this person they're excited about. And so the Messiah is supposed to, it's not the son of David but it's like in his line. So there's supposed to be somehow in David's line, there's going to be this Messiah who comes. And so it says, and God invites this person to sit at the right hand, which is, for us, we're not probably thinking, when someone sits at your right hand, you're just like, that was the open seat. But to sit at the right hand showed authority. It showed that this person was something. And if you remember James and John, two brothers, Jesus' disciples, those of you who've been here for this very long series through the book of Mark, they're trying to they get mom even involved. And they're like, hey, can we sit at your right and left? And, because they want authority, they want power. And so, and then in that culture, there's such a respect for the Father. No, in our culture, we kind of worship youth and youngness and things, but most other cultures revere older people. And so, especially your father was very important, and you would never be considered greater than your father because you lift up your father. And in Ethiopian culture, when I go over there, it's very much like that. In that, your father's really. I remember asking my one friend, sir, when you're in another culture, it's like you're trying to connect, but sometimes there's cultural disconnect. And I asked her how her family was, and I remember she's like, I don't know what you're asking me by that because you're an American. And I'm like, I'm trying to ask how your father is. She's like, okay. Because American culture, we think of family as what? Wife, kids, and everything. And I remember, I think I've told you this story before, but when the school I went to, they were asking the student, he was an African student, they said, how long are you going to be here? And I'm going to be here 7 years total. I'm going to finish my master's, and then I'm going to get, PhD and go back and everything. And so they're, oh, is your family here? He's like, oh, no, my family had to stay in Africa. And he goes, they're like, oh, it must be very hard. It must be very lonely. They said, well, no, my wife and kids are here. Because we think of family as, wife and kid. And so family's really important. Your father's very important. And so it's almost alien to us, but you would always, you wouldn't expect David to say, anything to give the extra honor to his great grandkid. And so there's this idea, this Messiah to come. And so it's genetically true, but theologically problematic. It's like a riddle. Because when we get the answer, it's a little more obvious. And so, Jesus, he tells this, why does Jesus tell this riddle? It's to explain things, and why does he tell it when he tells it here? I was thinking about this week because, he said a bunch of things a lot of times, but why here? And, we were having a discussion before worship began, and I talk a little bit occasionally about wrestling. I love sports, but I spend a lot of time wrestling. It's interesting because, for years I've coached and been involved in wrestling still, and now it's interesting. My son wrestles, which I never forced him into. I know you're thinking I forced him into that, right? But, I was always like, that's your call, because it's a tough sport. It's like you got to maintain your weight, you got to run a whole bunch, you got to do a lot of things. Anyway, so... It's interesting, though, because a lot of things he goes through are things I went through. And so I remember where I was watching a wrestling match this weekend, and, sometimes guys are taunting you, like trying to, they're shoving you out of bounds, different things, and, they're cheating. I remember being thrown over tables and stuff, because, again, I was a lighter heavyweight than you can imagine right now. But in wrestling, it was a challenge to act like Jesus sometimes. What would Jesus do? I mean, how would Jesus wrestle? That was kind of a question for me, and I became a believer while I was wrestling in college, and I had a very, physical style of wrestling, and so you're like, can I tear someone's arm off and share the love of Jesus? I actually almost did UFC when it was still young and early, and my coach was going to go half on a big I Heart Jesus, a cheesy tattoo on my chest, so when I was pummeling people, I could share Jesus. Anyway, point being, it's a challenge sometimes, and I think, it's a challenge, and we share this. Typically, I think one of the challenges for a lot of us is when we drive, right? Because it's I get a lot of nods on that, even for the people I thought didn't have the challenge. But you leave here on Sunday. I mean, when you get close to church, you kind of have to drive nice. You don't want to cut anybody off because you're close to the church building. And you don't want to cut somebody off at church and then be in next to them. Although I have had people at church cut me off. My wife was pregnant. I remember this board member cut my wife off. I'm like, seriously? But get the good spot so the pregnant lady's got to walk further. Anyway, it's a challenge sometimes because, there's people out there. And so it's a challenge sometimes, to live this thing out. Now, here is Jesus. He knows he's going to the cross. He's been frustrated with these people who have been asking him questions. He's been frustrated with how they're running things in the temple. But the reason I think Jesus tells this now is because he's explaining who he is. Because he loves them. He would love to see them, change their opinion, change the way they're thinking. And, Jesus, I think his question really tries to change the hearts one more time before he goes to the cross. And when you look at some of Jesus' followers, when we think of followers of Jesus, who do we think of? Like the disciples. No one wants to start, they're like, I don't know, who's that Thaddeus guy? But we don't want to name them all because you're afraid that I'll call you out and you'll be wrong. Or maybe you think Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because they wrote stuff, but they weren't all, anyway. That's a bigger question. But we think of a lot of times we think of the disciples. Even if we can't name them, you're thinking disciples, right? But there's these other people who sort of hang on. So there's Nicodemus. He shows up in kind of a famous passage in another book. We'll get to John. We've done Luke for 5 years, not entirely 5 years, but I worked it back in last week. We worked it back in. So someday we'll get to maybe doing the book of John. We've done some chunks out of there. But there's this guy named Nicodemus who comes to Jesus, and it's a famous passage. Jesus says, hey, you must be born again. And Nicodemus is like, what do you mean? I can't go back in. And Jesus is like, hey, you got to be, it's a spiritual rebirth. And then a lot of times we hear the word a born again Christian. That's where we get which is, sort of, there's really only that kind. You can't be a born-again Christian. But it was really popular in the 70s, I think. There's a Christian, and Christians have to be born again. And so, he kind of, and the second time, Nicodemus gets mentioned, he's in the Sanhedrin, telling his friends, hey, remember, person that must be heard before being judged. We see that in John 7. And finally, Nicodemus appears after the crucifixion of Jesus, to provide embalming spices, and he assists Joseph of Arimathea. And so Jesus has I kind of picture, is Nicodemus here? Nicodemus is figuring things out. So is Jesus still proclaiming who he is for people like that? Or maybe hadn't made that cross yet into faith. And then Joseph of Arimathea. According to Mark 15, which is, past where we are, he was a respected member of the council. He was looking for the kingdom of God. And so, is Joseph there? And then, Joseph immediately purchased, a linen shroud for him and different things. And so I kind of, how many of those who opposed Jesus had their eyes open even at the last part of his ministry? Because remember, most of his ministry is out in the countryside and different things. And so Jesus, in his, not his dying breath, but in his dying week, is telling people who he is. He's proclaiming, hey, look at the scriptures. You're not reading the whole thing. You're missing some pieces because, this whole section is kind of like people don't get it, but then Jesus is showing up. And so Jesus is showing them in the scriptures, hey, this is spoken. This is spoken to me. And, you may not get it, but, it's going to happen. And the teachers of the law, they're the authority in Israel. They have some correct theological things in some places, but Jesus is correcting them. They taught that Elijah must come first. Jesus is like, you're right. But you missed him because it was John. The teacher that knew the two greatest commands, but he still, still has to submit to Jesus' authority. And then we learned that the Jewish leaders teach that the Messiah is the descendant of David. But they still are kind of missing out. And so Jesus is explaining to them, and he's continually, calling to them to recognize who he is. And so Jesus says, hey, Psalm 110, you say it's messianic, but you missed something. It's not just a physical descendant of David. This person has to be something more. So after a day of questions, Jesus makes a question that's still relevant today. It's the nature and the identity of who Jesus is. And that's a question all of us will answer, even if our answer is not answering anything. And it's big implications then for how you live your life. It's big implications for how you spend eternity because, it's an important question. Now, earlier in Mark, which seems like a long time ago, but we were in chapter 8, and Jesus, earlier Mark, Jesus said, who do people say that I am? And if you remember the story, it's Mark chapter 8, verse 27, it says, Jesus' disciples left Galilee and went up to the villages near Caesarea Philippi. As they were walking along, he asked them, who do people say that I am? At Caesarea Philippi, it's like this big place for like emperor worship. There's temples to Roman gods everywhere. And so he's really in the midst of all this stuff. Here's all the gods that people worship in other nations, and he's asking his Jewish disciples who know who the God of Israel is. And he's in the midst of that, and they say, well, they reply, some say John the Baptist. And some say Elijah, and others say you're one of the prophets. And John the Baptist, he was this radical, prophet and a leader. And, Elijah was this powerful Old Testament Hebrew Bible prophet who confronted the prophets of Baal. And so there's all these people are saying this, these people are saying that. And then Jesus asked them, but who do you say I am? And Peter replied, you are the Messiah. And that term means the anointed one. We get the Greek word Christ from that. And so, Christ is not Jesus' last name, but it's his title. He's the Messiah. He's the one to come. And in the beginning of this series, we looked at Mark 1:1. It says, this is the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. Even knowing that he's the Messiah might not help you understand all of who he is. You can know Jesus and not really even fully understand who he is, but God will be revealing that to you. I remember when I first began to follow Jesus, I didn't really understand it all. But then, at some point, you're like, you ever watch the Book of Eli?
Yeah.
Okay. Man, those of you saw it, you're like, whoa, and then you're like, oh, and then you kind of watch the movie again, and you're like, now I see it. And if you ever saw the movie, and I don't like scary movies with Sixth Sense. No, don't. I don't like scary movies. I don't like to be scared. I kick, I flail when I'm scared. Everyone knows that. Some of you have been kicked. But you watch that movie, they're, oh, it makes perfect sense now. And so, the whole Messiah coming was like that. People kind of miss some things. Jesus comes, reveals who he is, and then they're like, oh, we missed that. And you can even have that personally. So who does the Bible say he is? And I've often heard people say, Jesus never says that, he was God. And I'm like, I think you've missed the Bible. and there's things that they say and do that we don't get because it's not a part of our culture, right? Our culture is more movies. That's why we make movie references. And, John 8, I kind of want to jump to John because, we're playing in John a little bit this week. Because this is my precursor to my 80-week series in the book of John coming up. No, I'm kidding. You guys are groaning, but you love it. Anyway. Because remember, John is like that gospel. One of these kids is doing his own thing. Some of you watched Sesame Street growing up, and it was like, 3 kids are jumping rope, and one is playing hopscotch. One of these kids is doing it. That's John. John chapter 8 says, the people retorted, you are a Samaritan devil. Didn't we say all along that you were possessed by a demon? Now remember we talked about the Good Samaritan last week? We think of Good Samaritan, like good and Samaritan go together. Samaritan devil. That kind of tells you how they felt about Samaritans. No, Jesus said, I have no demon in me, for I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. Although I have no wish to glorify myself, and you glorify me. He's the true judge. I tell you the truth, anyone who obeys my teaching will never die. The people said, now we know you're possessed by a demon. Even Abraham and the prophets died, but you say anyone who obeys my teaching will never die. Are you greater than our father Abraham? He died, and so do the prophets. Who do you think you are? Now, Abraham was the father of the Jewish people. If you read the Hebrew Bible, there's all kinds of cool stuff. I'm working through the archaeology Bible right now, which is fascinating. I am so geeked out on this thing. Some of you are like, that's horrible. And I'm like, oh no, there's this inscription that you really need to read. But Abraham is the father of the Jewish people. And, they would all, we are the sons of Abraham. We're the descendants of Abraham. It's kind of this big deal. Jesus answered, I don't glorify myself, it doesn't count, but it is my Father who glorifies me. You say he is our God, but you don't even know him. I know him. If I said otherwise, I would be as great a liar as you. I like Jesus very direct. You're not like, where do you come out on this, Jesus? You are a liar. But I do know him and obey him. Your father Abraham rejoiced as he looked forward to my coming. He saw it and was glad. The people said, you aren't even 50 years old. How can you say you've seen Abraham? Jesus answered, I tell you the truth, before Abraham was even born, I am. At that point, they pick up stones to throw at him. Jesus is hidden from the left. I am. Now, we hear I am, and we think it's an I and an am. But there's so much more importance and theological thing going on there. Jesus is saying, I always was. I am, I was, I will be. And if you know the story again of the Hebrew Bible, like I'm working through, I just read the story of Moses, and Moses, he's in the out kind of in the wilderness. He's tending a flock of sheep and goats or everything. He's tending some flocks, and he had been adopted into the family of the pharaohs, but he killed a guy, which is like I missed that somehow in the children's Bible. Moses killed a dude. He got mad. He was mistreating someone else, and then he has to run off because Pharaoh's going to get him. And so he's out tending some flocks, and then he just sees this burning bush that doesn't disappear, like it's like an eternal flame kind of thing. He's like, I don't know what's going on here. He approaches. God says, take off your sandals, and in the midst of revealing who he is, Moses is like, who are you? He's like, I am. I am that I am. I am. And so Jesus is saying, hey, you're the Messiah? That's me? Who am I? I'm God. And so Jesus continually reveals this. And, why doesn't Jesus explicitly solve his own riddle here in Mark 12? I think he leaves it for, he's been teaching it all along. And so, he's kind of, he's laying it out there, though, about who he is. And if I think I would be prone to answer and probably be an idiot. Again, wrestling, you're going to hear lots of wrestling analogies, although the season's kind of over, wrapping up for us. But, Josh was wrestling, and there's, if you see his face, you'll see what happened. So everyone's looking now. But, he was wrestling this guy this weekend, and he was kind of taunting, the guy was taunting Josh. And so, when I was taunted wrestling, I always wrestled with, do I stay under control and then just pin the guy and that, or, but in the end, I wouldn't, if a guy's taunting me, I definitely don't want to let him pin me, right? It's, you want to at least win. You're like, do I lash out? And so I kind of picture Jesus. Jesus is being taunted by his very creation. He's going to the cross. He's letting himself get pinned for us. And in that moment, I would want to lash out. I would be like, I am his son and God eternal. And I would burst into flames or something, like the Transfiguration, if you were there for that sermon. And that's my inclination. But Jesus ultimately comes to die for our sins. And so he doesn't blow up, he doesn't transfigure, because ultimately, this is the moment where Jesus is heading to the cross. Because of his great love for us, he restrains. Because of his great love for us, he continues to the cross so that we can have true life. Victory comes through this suffering servant. Victory comes through his great love for us. He dies for us. And when I'm thinking about this passage, I think one of the things I was thinking about is Jesus' great love for those who oppose him. He dies for us. But he died for all those people who were jerks to him too. He died for the people selling stuff in the temple that shouldn't be. He died for the Pharisees and the Sadducees. I struggle as a believer sometimes to love and pray for those who persecute me. Jesus said to do that. That's hard. But that's who we should be, and that's the model we should take. And so in your own life, think of somebody who you struggle to love. What can you do to share Christ with them? What can you do to love them in spite of the way they treat you? And I told you a story a couple weeks ago. Somebody was talking bad about me, and a friend of mine's who a pastor overheard it in the store. And he stepped up and goes, you can't talk bad about Pastor Jeff. I don't see him here. And I so badly wanted to go through my Facebook friends and kind of go, do you recognize this guy? You'll like him. So I want to find out who it is. But it's almost better I don't know, because you want to love people anyway. And it's hard to love people sometimes. And I would struggle to love the person if I knew who it was. But despite how people treat us, we need to love people anyway. And ultimately, I think where I land on this passage, I'm thinking about things, is who Jesus is matters. The whole story of the Bible is the story of Jesus coming. I remember going to church, and I grew up in a more traditional church, and then I was going to this church, and I remember everyone was talking about Jesus all the time. And I thought, why are they always talking about Jesus? They never talk about God. You see where we're going with that. And then I'm like, oh, that's why, because Jesus is God. Missed that one. But who Jesus is matters. And ultimately, who he matters in your own life. If you're going to be a believer and follower of Jesus, you need to know who he is. And ultimately that means submitting to his authority in your life. Jesus came that we might have life and have it to the full. And that means submitting his life, submitting our life to his ways. And it's hard sometimes. It's a challenge, right? You want a challenge? Read the Sermon on the Mount sometime. It's hard to love people when they don't love you. It's hard to pray for your enemies. But doing that stuff is what this whole faith thing is about. We often talk about the word Jesus-y here. And I was in a forum and they were like, do you mean Christ-like? I'm like, no, Jesus-y. Because Christ-like, I don't know, it's too religious kind of a word, and you kind of get this different sort of, but how would Jesus act and live? Putting our faith and trust in him, but then it's how we live after that. And I think sometimes we get to think, what that means is then we go to church, right? We look polite when we're at church, right? We let the pregnant lady have the spot, and then we're a jerk the next day at the mall. but what we're supposed to live and know Christ means we change the way we live, and ultimately following Him is the most important thing that we can do. So as the worship team comes back to play. Sorry, we're old school. The camera broke this week.